My grandfather was sentenced to death 3 times in the early 1900s in Russia. He wasn't a killer, a crook, or a thief. He was a Jew and a man who stood up for what he believed in, neither of which was particularly appreciated at the time. But what was most remarkable about him wasn't that he evaded the firing squad 3 times or escaped from Siberia. What was really remarkable is that he maintained his sense of humor and optimism throughout all of those experiences. So I spent several years working on a book based on his diaries, and throughout that entire time, one question bothered me. How was he able to remain optimistic under circumstances that included poverty, starvation, pogroms, and war, not to mention the death sentences, whereas I, who've never had any of those hardships, have been troubled by depression for the past 20 years. Depression that, even under the best of circumstances, leaves me with an underlying feeling of sadness, and at worst has led me to consider the alternative. Now, I know depression is biological, and I know it's no one's fault, and I'm grateful for the resources that are available. However, I still wanted to feel better, and I was looking for solutions. And I wish I had seen Sean Akers' video sooner. But after a lot of searching, I finally found something that resonated with me. And it was in a context of a course on stress reduction, in which I learned about the limbic system, the seat of our emotions and memories, but in a completely different context than I had in high school and college. Starting with the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped structure located deep in the brain that is considered a primitive structure because it focuses on the most basic elements, warning us of danger, without which we wouldn't survive to worry about other things. So you can imagine there's a time when you need to be warned to do something quickly, fight or flight. And today, the amygdala is what warns us to slam on the brakes before we have time to think about, have we left 100 feet for every 10 miles of speed? However, the amygdala has a tendency to warn us a little bit too much about things. Fortunately, there's another structure adjacent to the amygdala called the hippocampus. And that's where our memories are stored and indexed. And it's what allows us to process our experiences more thoughtfully, and it's what tempers our emotions. However, for very obvious reasons, the amygdala is more powerful than the hippocampus. And this can lead to a condition known as amygdala hijack, in which the emotions overwhelm our ability to process them thoughtfully. And this can lead in people who are prone to it to either stress, anxiety, or depression. But what was more important than just learning about these structures was learning that it is possible to reprogram our neural networks to be more positivity-seeking rather than negativity-seeking, like the amygdala. What I mean by this, it's actually very simple to do. There's a lot of positive events that happen every day, and they tend to just flip by our consciousness without enough notice to register as memories. And that can be something as simple as, waiting online at the checkout counter behind somebody who is unloading their cart, one more item, and they turn and look at you and say, "Oh, you have only a few items, why don't you go ahead?" Or someone running after you saying, "Hey, you dropped something." Now, neither of those are really monumental events, and if you put them on opposite sides of the scale, they probably have the same weight. Or if you give them values, one's a +1, one's a -1, and that neither of those is going to affect your life, and shouldn't even affect your whole day. But yet, because the brain is negativity-seeking, we tend to remember negative events. So just as an example, how many of you remember the last time you were looking for a parking space in a crowded lot or structure and were probably under some time pressure? You've got your eye on a space and someone else pulls into it right before you. Anybody have that experience, maybe even today? Well, for me, it was last Friday night, La Jolla Village Square. On the other hand, do you remember the last time when you were on a crowded city street and someone in oncoming traffic stops before the intersection instead of blocking the box just like everybody else has done before him, and it makes it possible for you to make that left turn? Hardly anybody. And that's because we do tend to focus on the negative events because we are wired that way. But by focusing on positive events, we can actually retrain our brains. And once you start identifying and recognizing those positive events, you realize how many there are. In fact, I had what I would call a +9 event last week. My son called me, we had a nice conversation, and after we hung up, I realized he didn't call because he needed anything. He just called. And I mean, that was really powerful. It was a big enough deal for me that I tweeted it out, you know, as really a highlight of God knows how long. But I found that when I do focus on positive events like that, I can really feel sort of like sunshine coming up inside. And it doesn't make the other stuff go away completely, but it kind of lessens it. And maybe if I feel better for a few minutes, that's pretty good. So while I was still working on applying these principles to myself, I discovered something else. A few weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine, there was an article on post-traumatic growth. Growth, yes, not stress, what we usually expect to see after those first two words. And this discovery was the result of a phenomenon that was discovered following the Vietnam War, when researchers interviewed aviators who had been captured during the war. And fully 61% of them said that they had benefited emotionally or psychologically from the experience of being held captive. Furthermore, the ones who had been most harshly treated by their captors felt it was the most beneficial experience. Well, my negativity-seeking brain immediately dismissed it. I figured, well, they must have just rationalized that I may be a captive, but at least I'm not out on the battlefield. But that wasn't it. And nor was it a matter of trying to attach meaning to the time they'd spent in captivity. And here's what's interesting about it, and I think Jeremy is a very good example of this. We each have a tendency to build walls somewhere beyond our consciousness that we've never seen. However, the experience of trauma causes you to come right up against that wall and begins to crumble. And when that happens and you see beyond the wall, you see an extension of the world that you know, and it may look identical, but since you've never been beyond that wall, you have no idea, is that air safe to breathe? Are the natives friendly? Do the laws of gravity apply? And it's actually not the process of seeing the wall crumble or coming right up to it that leads to emotional growth, but grappling with the questions of what does my world look like now? And it doesn't require anything as dramatic as being held captive or even anything as dramatic as losing your eyesight at age 19. It can be surviving a car accident, losing a loved one, or imagine a child who loses a parent at a very young age. And all they've ever assumed, although they've never thought about it, is my parent will always be there. There will always be someone to care for me. So we each have these walls, and if you want to know where yours are, it's pretty easy. Just think to yourself about something you've never done, maybe not even something you've thought of doing, but whether it's skydiving or getting up on a stage and speaking in front of 150 people, which is certainly not something I would have done a year ago. And when you ask yourself this question, could I do this thing? And you hear that little voice in your head saying, oh, no, I could never do that. And frankly, I'm still not going to go skydiving, and I don't even advise that to be a wall you break down. But when you experience some kind of traumatic event and go through the process of realizing, I don't know what the rest of my life is going to look like, I don't know what the world is going to look like, and I don't know how I'm going to fit into it, that leads to emotional growth, even though nobody wants to get there that way. And one of the forms that emotional growth takes is optimism. And optimism is linked to resilience, the ability to get knocked down and bounce back again, even if you're going to get knocked down over and over again. Some people have this trait naturally, and other people acquire it through the experience of the hardships that they may experience during life. But the good news is anybody can develop it. Just in 2010, a researcher by the name of Gail Wagnild developed a 14-question inventory, a test of your resilience score. And although I wrote down the URL for this test, if you want to check your own, all you need to do is Google test your resilience score and it'll turn up. But in addition to putting together this test, she also identified 5 characteristics of resilience. So the first one is knowing your purpose in life. Now, when I hear a statement like that, I think of having to climb a mountain in Tibet, but that's not it at all. In fact, Dr. Wagnild argues that it's very easy to figure out your purpose in life. You just look at what role you play in other people's lives. What do people turn to you for? And that, if it's something you can embrace, is probably your purpose. Just from my own perspective, I can tell you, I think that my purpose is to be a good friend to people. Somebody who anticipates what difficulties somebody else can have and think of a way to help them. Now, that may sound very fuzzy and touchy-feely, and it may sound insignificant, and certainly compared to a lot of other purposes that people have, I agree. On the other hand, it does work for me, and I'm comfortable with that. Then there's perseverance, and everybody, of course, knows what that means. That's this stick-to-itiveness, what we associate with trying and trying again if you want to achieve success. A third trait is self-reliance, knowing that you can count on yourself in case of an emergency. And that doesn't mean you can solve all the problems if there's an emergency, but it simply means you're not the kind of person who will fall apart and be completely unable to function if some disaster occurs. Equanimity is just the ability to roll with the punches, the ordinary ups and downs of life that everybody is going to experience, and not feeling that failure or disappointment or rejection is a permanent state. It's something that everybody experiences, and it will pass. And finally, what she calls coming home to yourself is sort of being comfortable in your own skin and comfortable with the choices and decisions you've made in life. Not that all of them have been correct, and it's certainly possible that you've made a decision you deeply regret. On the other hand, you don't need to focus on, I should have, I wish I hadn't, but just try to make the next decision more thoughtfully, more carefully. Oops. So if you have any doubt about the importance of optimism in helping you get up again, and it being an actual trait that will help you survive, let me go back to the experience of my grandfather. If he hadn't have been optimistic, he would not have dropped a note in the street that he hoped somebody would pick up as he was being led to the prison where he was going to be executed in only 2 days. If he hadn't dropped the note, a young girl wouldn't have found it and followed the instructions to notify his family that he'd been arrested and sentenced and would shortly be executed. If he hadn't dropped the note that the girl picked up and brought to the family, they wouldn't have been able to hire a lawyer to bribe or maybe negotiate with the commandant of the prison to have my grandfather's sentence commuted to merely 10 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by permanent exile. And by the way, that was known as getting a tenner, and it was the equivalent in Russia at the time of being declared not guilty. But if he hadn't been optimistic and dropped that note, he probably also wouldn't have been optimistic about his ability to escape from Siberia, knowing that he would have to travel 3,000 miles to get back to Warsaw without food, money, or legal papers, and knowing that he was going to be pursued by the Cossacks and secret police the whole way. So if he hadn't been an optimist, that he wouldn't have dropped the note, he wouldn't have tried to escape from Siberia, gotten back to Warsaw, and then decided that he wanted to find the young girl who dropped the note to thank her. And he could have been discouraged by the fact that nobody knew her name because it wasn't important to find out where to send the thank you note when they only had 2 days to save his life. And if he hadn't been optimistic, he wouldn't have tried to piece together clues from people's memories of over a year earlier, because that's how long it took him to travel back. And then once he even found out who she was and was told, oh, you can't meet her, she's too good for you, he wouldn't have tried to find a way to meet her, which was finagled by some relatives. So if he hadn't dropped the note, gotten reprieve from his death sentence, escaped from Siberia, and returned home and found this girl, he wouldn't have married her and made her my grandmother. And not only would I not have been born, but I wouldn't have been named for the grandmother who saved my grandfather from his 3rd death sentence. So that was a whole series of optimistic events, which you probably won't need quite that much optimism to get through your lives. But I just want to close with a couple of thoughts from people. And just recently, the Dalai Lama spoke in San Diego, and he said, choose to be optimistic. When you have the choice, it's easier and it feels better. So I hope you will consider that and look at the positive events that go on around you and appreciate them and feel better about it.